So first of all, Armin, can you tell us what is the textual history of the Bible?
Leigh, I hope you allow me to start with a little bit of personal history. Almost some 10 years ago, I wrote a book on the biblical manuscripts from the Dead Sea, the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. And I needed to find information on textual versions of the Bible. I needed to find information on the Septuagint of the book of Jeremiah, or so exotic things like the Coptic text of the book of Kohelet. And it was very, very difficult. So the idea was born to have a reference work which brings that kind of information together. To take serious that a biblical text has its own history, that the Hebrew text of the Bible has a history that's very different from its Greek text or its Coptic text or its Latin texts. Listen to the plural. That gave the idea to the textual history of the Bible, and very quickly the project developed the life of its own, and we ended up with 3 different volumes. One being dedicated to the Hebrew Bible itself, a second one being dedicated to its deuterocanonical scriptures, and a third one being dedicated to all other questions connected with the textual history and textual criticism of the Bible, which we call a companion volume. Today we focus on the second volume about the deuterocanonical scriptures, and I'm proud to say that this is a unique achievement, and that you should listen very carefully to what Matthias and Frank have to tell you about this fascinating enterprise.
And so why is the textual history of the Bible important at this moment?
I think you need to understand that many people work for different reasons on the text of the Bible. When they want to have information what the earliest text of the Bible is, that's very difficult to find. But sometimes that's a key piece of information when you write a commentary, let's say, as we speak today about THB Volume 2 on the Book of Tobit. Other people want to know how Tobit, to stay with my example, was understood in its history after it was written, long after it was written, how it was understood, for example, in the Coptic world, how it was understood in the Old Church Slavonic world. These might seem exotic questions, but one of the things you need to understand about THB is that we want to provide information for biblical scholars for sure, who work on Tobit, but also for scholars who work on Slavonic literature, on the history of Slavonic literature. And they want to know something about the Slavonic versions of Tobit. The same is true, of course, for the Coptic version, which I mentioned earlier, but I'm 100%, Frank is going to tell you a lot more about this than I ever could.
And so can you describe some changes in your academic disciplines and how this volume responds to those changes?
When some 20 years ago, scholars tried to analyze the text of a given biblical book, the situation was pretty clear-cut. You had the Hebrew text, which was mainly considered to be the medieval Hebrew text, and was mainly considered to be the closest to what you can get towards the original text of any biblical book. When all biblical Dead Sea Scrolls were published, our whole understanding of the textual history of the Bible changed dramatically. We understood that it was way more pluralistic, that each biblical book has a textual history of its own before the Bible was born, and to an extent, continued to have a textual history of its own even after it became part of the Bible. So what we do in THB is to have a close look at the textual histories in the plural of each biblical book, taking it very serious that the textual history of something like the book of Jeremiah or the book of Tobit in Greek is rather different than their respective textual histories in Hebrew or Coptic or Slavonic. So that's something that has never been done before. And a fascinating synergy developed when we began to see how even versions that were hardly analyzed before have an impact on our understanding of the very early history of some biblical books. That's true, for example, for the book of Daniel on the Old Church Slavonic version of the book of Daniel, which gives us new information about the early Greek history of Daniel.
Matthias, can you just break down for us exactly what is Textual History of the Bible, Volume 2? What's it focusing on here?
So the focus of THB2 is on the deuterocanonical scriptures. THB2 is really telling the story of both the canonical and the textual history of these deuterocanonical writings. Books that are considered part of the Bible by some churches, but are not part of the Hebrew Bible. So the story that we're telling in THB2 has really never been told before. We've seen glimpses of it. We knew that these various books survive in different language traditions, but we've never really told the story in its entirety. So for the first time, we collect information about all the known textual versions and translations of each of these deuterocanonical books, roughly up to the 10th century. And we're able to do this because we assembled a great team of contributors, 110 international experts from all over the globe came together, 13 area editors, 2 volume editors. And so together we produced these 3 volumes that are THB2.
And so who's the audience for Volume 2, and for whom is this work particularly relevant? And is it relevant for scholars outside the field as well?
My own thinking about THB2 has really changed dramatically over the 7 years that I've been involved with this project. Initially, I thought of it as a rather specific project that would be of interest only to a sort of niche group of scholars. But the more I worked on it, the more I began to understand what is involved here and who the different people are who might have a keen interest in this. And I can tell you that right now, 2 volumes came out last year, 1 volume just came out now. I'm already receiving emails from colleagues from a wide variety of academic disciplines. So obviously colleagues who work on individual books, say Ben Sira or Tobit or Judith, will have an interest in THB2 because we tell them in which language traditions the book is attested. Colleagues who work on biblical manuscripts will have an interest in THB2 because this has really been a focus of our work to collect as much information as we have on the diverse manuscript traditions. Then we have colleagues who work in particular language traditions, say the Ethiopic Bible, the Coptic Bible, the Arabic Bible. And of course, you cannot talk about the Bible in these various traditions without taking into consideration the books that we call the deuterocanonical writings. There are colleagues who are interested in the canonical and textual histories of the Bible. You would think that these exist already, but when I started working on this project and I looked around, I found, much to my surprise, that there really are no comprehensive histories of the canon of the Bible in these language traditions. And last, but certainly not least, people who are interested in the history of these churches will take a keen interest in the manuscript traditions, the way in which the Bible has been transmitted, and of course in the way in which these various traditions interact with each other. So I think THB2 is not just of interest to scholars who work in the field of textual criticism, but it will soon prove to be appealing and really a crucial tool to scholars in a variety of different academic disciplines.
And what kind of information can a reader find in THB2?
So THB2 grew and became much bigger than we initially had anticipated. It really breaks down into two parts. Part 1, which is volume A, consists of a series of overview articles that provide the reader with detailed information about both the canonical and textual histories of the deuterocanonical writings. So here we go through the various language traditions and assemble in quite some detail all the available information about the Bible and the deuterocanonical texts in, say, the Syriac or the Ethiopic, the Coptic, the Arabic, a long list of texts. And then there's part 2. Part 2 consists of 2 volumes, volumes B and C, and there we go through all the deuterocanonical books, book by book. And for each book, we begin with an article, a brief entry that summarizes the textual history of that particular book, which is then followed by individual entries on each of the language traditions. So for Tobit or Judith or Psalm 151, for example, we list all the language traditions and we have entries that walk the reader in detail through all the evidence that we have. How do we know this particular language tradition of this book? What is the manuscript evidence? What is the research that has been done on this particular version? What is its text critical value? And so on and so forth. So we're really casting our net wide in that we're covering all language traditions up to the 10th century, primary and secondary translations, but we're also drilling down deep in the individual entries, and that we look into the manuscript evidence that I should mention only very few experts in the world were able to write about.
So you mentioned how you're walking the reader through the detail and the research of this volume, which, seems really extensive. Obviously, this was a massive undertaking. Can you just walk us through the actual process of how you put this together and some of the challenges of producing volume 2?
It was about 8 years ago now that Armin Lange, who was really the mastermind behind THB, contacted me and asked me whether I would have an interest in working on THB2. I immediately understood that there really is a lot of work that needs to be done. Textual history of the Bible is a well-plowed field. A lot of work has been done. The same is not true of deuterocanonical books. I knew, or at least I had a vague idea initially, that there was yet a lot of work that had to be done. So I quickly agreed to do this and then started to read in earnest about the scholarship that had been done. And I found, a bit to my surprise, that there really wasn't very much out there. And so the first thing I had to do is to come up with a table of contents that would list all the deuterocanonical books. And then I had to find out in which languages these deuterocanonical books were attested. And once I had a table of contents, which took me a long, long time and many, many emails with friends all around the world, I had to find people who could actually write these entries. At some point, it became clear that the task was so big that I couldn't possibly do it by myself. And this is when Frank Feder, my very dear friend, joined the project and saved my life. And so together we continued to work on the table of contents and then got in touch with colleagues that actually had lots of knowledge about the various language traditions, and most importantly, that were familiar with the manuscript traditions. It became evident that that really mattered most. And so we compiled a list of 110 contributors, stayed in contact with them as they were working on their essays, and at some point the essays came in, we edited them, sent them back, had certain follow-up questions, and so over a period of 7 years, this project grew.
Frank, THB2 doesn't simply provide overviews for individual language traditions, but it also explores the various ways in which language traditions, especially Coptic, Ethiopic, and Arabic versions, build and depend on each other and interact. But there's been very little research done in this area. So can you just give us an example or two?
Yeah, Leigh, this is true, and especially for me as a specialist for the Oriental version of these Oriental Orthodox churches, in that case Coptic, for us THB2 is so important because it shows not only the interdependence, what you mentioned, between the Coptic, a kind of a mother version for Ethiopic and Arabic, but also these textual histories are interwoven, and they build on traditions which in somehow divided again in the course of the history. So it might be that the Arabic version is still pretty unexplored today. And my colleagues for the Arabic version really wrote these articles not only in THB2, but especially the canonical history and the textual history. What they wrote there is really the most actual overview over the widespread history of the Arabic version. And we added, to give an example, we added, for example, 2 sections under the general section of the book of Jeremiah and Baruch. And this is the prophecy of Jeremiah to Pashur. This plays with quotation in the New Testament in the Gospel of Matthew, where this is also mentioned, and the history of the captivity in Babylon. This is clearly speaking something very particular because it is somehow the deuterocanonical of the deuterocanonical. So what is interesting about, we can surmise that there has been a Greek model, but this has not survived. So we only have Coptic, Arabic, and Ethiopic, which are interdependent. And it's very interesting that this text of the prophecy of Jeremiah to Pashur was only extant in so-called church liturgy books for the Holy Week in that case, and from Coptic translated into Arabic. And from Arabic or Coptic, this is still a matter of research, into Ethiopic. And although this story was not part of the Coptic Bible, it entered via the translation from Coptic into Arabic, the Arabic Bible. So it became part of the book of Jeremiah. And this is really something absolutely fantastic and new to the other colleagues of the other field, but they can also tell such stories. You see, you can, as a specialist and as a generally interested reader, find your way through THB2.
And you mentioned going through those online versions, how you can look at the Ethiopic and the Arabic version. In terms of this volume that you put out, we have it in both online and book formats. And, can you just share the screen with us and demonstrate what a typical reader would find in the online volume?
Well, thank you, Leigh. This is an important point. Of course, the books are worth reading at any rate, but the online version has a special advantage. So the reader can immediately, reading an article, jump via the hyperlinks to the other cited version or text in the moment he or she is interested in. I might share my screen to show you maybe a brief example of that. For example, here the text I myself wrote about the Coptic version, the canonical history and volume A of the Coptic version. And there's, for example, a section reporting the story that the patriarch of the Syriac church in the early 7th century visited the Egyptian colleague at Alexandria, and that was the time when the Persian emperor of the Sassanid kingdom invaded Syria. And so the patriarch of Antiochia, the Syrian patriarch, came to Egypt, and there one of the important Bible versions of the Syriac tradition, the patriarch of Syria visited Egypt, and there the famous Syro-hexapolaric translation was done in Egypt in exile. So, and if you read about this here in this part, in the text on the Coptic canon, there is mentioned that this famous Syro-hexapolaric version, what is a very literal translation from Greek into Syriac, was actually done in Egypt. And if you are interested in more of this story on the Syriac, you can jump from here to the first volume of THB and read about the Syro-hexapla, what it is, what it exactly means, what importance it has for the Syriac version. So I hope you understand. So every article in the online version especially gives that opportunity to follow your research interest for the general reader and for the general public, who can learn a lot of history of the church and the biblical versions just browsing through THB.
Thank you, Frank. That must be fascinating, and I can imagine all the different rabbit holes that researchers will end up going down there. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Matthias and Armin, for talking with us today about the Textual History of the Bible, Volume 2,